I'd like to welcome everyone to the first Diversity and Inclusion Seminar for the 2016-17 academic year. Thank you for attending. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Lydia Villa-Komaroff. Dr. Komaroff is a molecular biologist, an executive, and a diversity advocate. She is co-founder, board member, and former CEO and chief scientific officer of Cytonome, a company developing and manufacturing purpose-built cell sorters. Dr. Villa-Komaroff received her BA from Goucher College and her PhD in cell biology from MIT. As a postdoc, she was lead author of a landmark paper reporting the first synthesis of mammalian insulin in bacterial cells. During her career as a bench scientist, she focused on using the methods of recombinant DNA to address a number of fundamental questions in different fields in collaboration with neurologists, developmental biologists, endocrinologists, and cell biologists. She's held faculty positions at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, Children's Hospital in Boston, Harvard Medical School. She served as Vice President for Research of Northwestern University in Illinois and Vice President of Research and Chief Operating Officer of the Whitehead Institute in Cambridge. Dr. Villa-Komaroff currently serves on the boards of the Massachusetts Life Science Center by gubernatorial appointment, the American Type Culture Collection, an independent private nonprofit biological resource center and research organization, the Keck Graduate Institute, and the Boston-based Biomedical Careers Program. She is a member of the National Scientific Foundation, the NSF Committee on Equal Opportunity in Science and Engineering, the Advisory Council of the NSF Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, and the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine, a joint committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And she is a founding member of the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, or SACNAS. It is my pleasure to introduce to the podium Dr. Lydia Villa-Komaroff.
Thank you, Yvette. It's a great pleasure to be here, particularly at the invitation of Yvette, whom I had the pleasure to know a very long time ago when we were both at Children's Hospital. So, as you know, I'm a molecular biologist by training, an immunologist by necessity, and I've have been a diversity advocate for most of my career, starting as a graduate student when I was told that I could attend the ski meeting in Utah if I would go give a presentation at FASIP in Atlantic City. I mean, really, of course. So as I got those materials, there was a notice in the pre-meeting materials that a group of individuals would be meeting to discuss Native American and Mexican Americans in science and the lack of their presence in the sciences and what we could do about it. So I said, oh, this is interesting. Since I had decided to be a scientist at about the age of 9, it had never occurred to me that perhaps I was a rare species. So I went to that meeting, and it may say something that when I introduced myself to the 17 other people in the room, which represented all of the Native American and Mexican American PhDs or potential PhDs in the country at the time. So I said I was from MIT, and one of the gentlemen there, also a graduate student, said, oh, what military institute is that? So it was more likely that a woman Mexican American would be at a military institute at MIT, even in the minds of someone who could relate to me and whom I could relate to. So I think that got me started in my interest in diversity. And I sort of plugged along for my whole career, but I always put science first. I mean, after all, if you're a scientist and if you wish to advance in the career, you really do have to take care of business before you can give back to the community in any meaningful way. If you're not at the table, you can't help make the decisions. So much of my career was focused on getting at that table. And so you heard some of the things that I've done. Now I am failing retirement and finding that at this point in my life and career, I can focus on some of the things that have interested me for a very long time in a very deep way. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some of the thought processes that I've learned have occur in all of us and which in this era, where despite the fact that there is certainly plenty of direct biases against minority groups in this country, we have not yet gone as far as we need to go. Nevertheless, we have come a long way. And in many institutions and places, including most of the ones we're familiar with, direct prejudice is not the issue. Nevertheless, there has been an enormous long time, I've been at it 40 years now, where we have made only incremental improvement in representation of the population of this country in our centers of higher education. And we need to do something about that if we wish to keep the country in its primary place in terms of primacy in science and economics and all of the important things that humans do in this country. But first, a small diversion. I understand that all of you are reading this book or have read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and she played a role in my career as well. HeLa Cells, as you know now, are the oldest cell line in the country, and they have been maintained in a fairly pristine shape at ATCC, which began as a congressionally mandated repository for cells and microbes of all kinds to be maintained, to be annotated, and origins to be collected, and so that when someone got something from ATCC, they would know that it was indeed what they were asking for. And this, as you know, is a current problem. There are a lot of papers out there in the literature which think they are using cells of a particular origin, but in fact, very often they end up being HeLa cells or CHO cells, because those cells are very hardy and they tend to spread themselves around at large. So the ATCC maintains a HeLa population, which is in fact HeLa cells. These cells, however, have changed over time. They are quite aberrant in their chromosomal makeup and in their function. Nevertheless, they have been incredibly useful. It is because of HeLa cells that we, for example, have the polio vaccine. I used HeLa cells in my graduate work to show that poliovirus, which is a long RNA virus, has a single site of initiation and then makes all of its proteins by proteolysis rather than by synthesis off that RNA. There have been 60,000 cells using HeLa cells in their work, and so we can thank Henrietta Lacks for that. For those cells. Increasingly, cells like HeLa cells are being used less often because of the aberrancy in their chromosomal makeup. All of the systems that are at work in a cell are pretty messed up. And so we have to go back to primary cells, which we're getting better at making now. And so HeLa cells will retain their usefulness, but increasingly they are being replaced by primary cells, which more closely reflect the cells that we wish to study. End of digression. My serious interest in some of the academics that underlie the basis of bias in this country and around the world really began in part as on this committee at the National Academy of Sciences when I was asked to co-chair with Florence Bonner, who is provost at Howard University and a psychologist, a meeting, a workshop on minority women in academia. What was the current status? What could we do? Well, Florence and I have been around the block a few times, and we were really tired of meetings where we talked about the problem to each other and not much came of it. And so we thought surely there could be something else. And Florence pointed out rather forcefully that people like me, that is to say molecular biologists, chemists, physicists, mathematicians, tended to disregard or and disrespect the work of our colleagues in the psychological sciences. And that a great deal was actually known about human behavior, and if those of us in the, quote, hard sciences would recognize and act upon this work, we might actually make greater progress. And so at this workshop, which was held now 2 years ago in Washington, we brought together a group of people, and I learned an enormous amount about the kinds of things that have been learned, the data behind them, and that's what I would like to share with you today, because I think that this problem of how human beings think, in part because of the limitations of this structure. You know, the brain is a incredibly wonderful and complicated piece of tissue in our bodies. It's very complex. I've heard one biologist say that the number of cells in the brain exceeds the number of stars in the known universe. And remember that many of those stars are talking to another 50,000 cells, many of those cells are talking to another 50,000 cells, and even those which do not are in communication chemically, so that all of the cells are in an incredibly complicated mash and intricate structure of communication, which talks about our behavior. On the other hand, the amount of data that the human brain has to process every single second is gigantic. It is perhaps the original big data problem. And so the mind is limited in its ability to deal with all of this input which is coming in all the time through all of our senses. And so the brain has evolved mechanisms to filter that information and to act on it in a way which conserves energy. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about today. But first I want to talk about the problem which most of you know very briefly. And that is, well, what is going on in the United States with respect to our representation in academia. And so as part of the workshop, we commissioned several papers and asked people to write summaries of the data and to indicate questions which still needed to be answered. So Sylvia Hurtado, who's at UCLA in California, and one of her students did a study where they simply accumulated for us the data that's out there from the Census Bureau and NSF and so forth, so that we could have a breakdown of the percentage representation of various groups in academia. And this is all academia. So you can see that white men and white women are far and away the majority of that population, whereas underrepresented women, which includes both Hispanics and blacks, as the federal government decrees a minority in this country, Asian women and underrepresented men and Asian men are a very small proportion. Relative to the proportion of individuals in the population in this country, Asians are overrepresented in STEM faculty. But if you look over here, you will see that Asian males and Asian women together tend to be underrepresented in the upper ranks of the professoriate and in those positions of decision-making like deans and presidencies relative to their population. And as you can see, underrepresented women are most represented in the lower ranks of the professoriate, whereas white men are predominantly found in the higher ranks of the professoriate. So that's the issue. We have made progress, as I've said. You can see that this is just women in this slide, because that's what the workshop was about. And you can see that women have gone from 26.6% in 1993 to 40.9% in 2013. That's a nice change. And minority women, underrepresented groups, and this is both men and women, have gone from 7 to 12%. That's nice, but it's a little slow. And if you look at you superimpose the graph for women over the graph for minorities, you can see that the status of women has improved, or at least their position in faculties has improved more rapidly than has that of minorities. So what's going on here? Well, one of the things we asked was that a paper be done, a study be done about the career paths of women, to just lay it out. We all talk about the pipeline. We disagree about that terminology. Is it a leaky pipeline? What is it? And we wanted to know precisely where do people drop out. And so this is what was found by Ginther and Kahn. They are statisticians and behavioral economists, and they cooperated on this study. And they found basically the following. Women of color are as likely as white women to graduate from high school. They are as likely as white women to start college, and if they complete college, underlined, they complete college, they are as likely to major in a scientific field, in a STEM field. People of color, and now this includes men, are less likely than white people to graduate from college in the first place, and secondly, to attain a PhD in science, even if they graduate from college with a STEM degree. And furthermore, if they complete college and they get a PhD, they are less likely to obtain a tenure track job in a non-minority serving institution, like this one, or my institution at MIT, or Harvard, or any of the major research institutions in the country. Women of color are more likely than white women to be employed in a non-tenure track position. They are more likely to be employed at a minority serving institution, and they are, interestingly, more likely to get tenure if they complete college, graduate with a STEM degree, get a PhD in the sciences, get a job at a non-minority serving institution, which are all less likely than others. If they get that job, they are more likely to get tenure at a Research One university than a white woman. Men of color are less likely to achieve tenure than either white men or white women. Part of this is because of biases that we all share, and this is true of all humans in a particular culture. We all have biases which have developed, and it's part of this business of ways of thinking about data that we get, ways of responding to information, and we'll come to that in a bit. I've only listed 4 here because they're very interesting, and they also tend to be exemplified by what's going on in the current political campaign. It turns out that the strongest bias against women is a motherhood bias. If a woman is a mother, she is deemed to be much less competent than a woman who is not a mother, or certainly than a man. And how do we know this? The kind of study that is done is to take CVs, which are essentially identical, 2 women with names which are from identical ethnic groups, usually white women in this study, and identical CVs in terms of graduation and where you went to college and the number of publications and the quality of publications and where those publications are. The only difference in these 2 CVs is 1 line that indicates membership in PTA. If that line is present on the CV, that woman is deemed far less capable than the other woman, or than anyone else who's applying for that position, and would be offered a lower salary, and would be offered less benefits in the position. This is kind of striking. Then there's the recall bias. Women's mistakes tend to be noticed more and remembered longer than do mistakes made by men. Sound familiar? Attribution bias. A woman's success is very frequently attributed to luck, whereas a man's success will be attributed to skill. And these are not thought through, and these are shared, I repeat, by men and women of all ethnicities in the United States. Then there's a leniency bias, which is that objective rules tend to be applied more rigorously to women than they are to men within institutions. So even when we have rules, we tend to apply these rules more strongly towards women than to men. And I say we because, again, I want to emphasize this is not something which is particular to any particular gender or ethnic background or anything else. It's an American trait. And some of these are also shared in other Western civilizations. There are biases which are peculiar to women of color, which were brought out. The African American women tend to be judged more harshly than are white women or African American men if they make a mistake. Hispanics, and African women are expected to fail, and when they don't, it's because they're really lucky or have been given a hand up when not on merit. Hispanics are subject to even lower assumptions of competence than African American women are, and that is thought to be by Joan Williams, who did these studies, due to the fact the immigration in this country from the Latin American countries were assumed to be immigrants. And I can attest to this. When I once visited my mother-in-law at her new home in a condo association in California, she introduced me to a neighbor, and the neighbor said, "Oh, how long have you been working for Jackie?" And Jackie, my lovely mother-in-law, said, "Excuse me, this is my daughter-in-law, the Harvard professor." I was an instructor at the time, but never mind. Asian American women tend to be viewed as either technically competent but lacking in leadership abilities, or as passive and therefore less competent. So these, again, these biases are shared by the women against whom they are also exhibited, so that African American women are harder on their counterparts than as anybody else, and the same is true throughout. So this is not a white man's problem. This is an American problem. And where does it come from? So now I'm going to talk about 3 books, and perhaps you might consider them for future reference as you do this group book thing. The one I'll spend the most time on is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's a behavioral economist, and he summarizes in this book 30 years of work. It's a spectacularly thorough and wonderful and detailed book. I think I'm on my 3rd reading, and I recommend highly, certainly the first third. That is mostly what I cover here. Then I'm going to talk about these other 2 books in passing a little bit. One is Blind Spot by Menagerin Benage and Anthony Greenwald, who are over at Harvard, and they have spent their last 30 years studying what they call implicit bias. And that is those things which govern our behavior, but which nevertheless we may not be aware of when we do them. And this is a really good review of all of that literature. And finally, Whistling Vivaldi, which is by Claude Steele, who is the provost at Berkeley until just recently, and a social scientist, a psychologist, who began his career by wondering about the gap in achievement between African Americans and other students in college. And so he spent a good 30 years studying that problem, he and his academic descendants. And he summarizes that work here. It's a very short book. It's a beautifully written book, and it's an easy and informative read. And the title of it comes from a friend of his in South Chicago, who was a very large and imposing black man who noticed, how could you not, that when he walked down the street, white people tended to cross over to the other side. And he was a professor at the University of Chicago, or a journalist, I forget which, and this bothered him. So he thought about what was underlying that, and as he walked down the street, he would start whistling Vivaldi or some other classical work. It immediately changed the dynamic, because an individual who is whistling the classical work is not an immediate threat to a civilized person. And so Claude Steele, whom I've had the privilege of hearing speak, he's a wonderful speaker, uses that to illustrate his point. And this is about stereotype threat, which is kind of a subset of what happens because of implicit bias, which we will use even against ourselves, not just against others in our reactions. So first, the human mind does an enormous amount automatically. This saves energy and it saves time. These actions are automatic, they're unconscious, and they're unintentional. And they happen whenever we encounter information like words, pictures, CVs, and so forth. When we see something or anything, related information that we have accumulated through our life comes into our mind, and we have learned over time in a very deep way how to respond. So if I say dog, all of you will immediately have an association with that term. Pets, or being bitten, or little yippy dogs that you hate or love, or big dogs, which are either a threat or a comfort depending on your own experiences through your life. As Kahneman says in his book, most of the time these judgments are pretty useful. They serve us well and they're appropriate. But they're not always. And even when we're wrong, when they are not serving us well, we're very confident in our decisions based upon these thoughts. Now he puts it in terms of 2 systems of thinking. This is an old concept, actually, which he was building upon, but he called them System 1 and System 2 in a way of trying to separate them and make them more easy to think about. There is the automatic intuitive System 1, and that system operates very automatically, very quickly. It's from the gut, as you might say. It doesn't require much effort. There's no voluntary control of this System 1. And it is always on when we're awake. System 2 is very deliberative. It allocates attention. This is what you use when you're thinking hard about a problem. It's orderly, it's deliberate, and it's usually operating in a sort of a backdoor mode. It's kind of lazy, from which I conclude that perhaps laziness is an evolutionary positive thing. And it generally accepts System 1's suggestions. So you could think of System 1 this way. System 1 is our old friend here, and there's System 2, the highly rational individual. Unfortunately, System 2 is surrounded by and influenced by System 1 all the time. Oops. So System 1 includes innate survival skills, and it's really kind of at two levels. The first is things which are very deeply embedded in our evolutionary history. Fear of snakes, dislike of insects. Things that are different are a threat if you live in the jungle surrounded by creatures which would like to eat you for lunch. And it's very ancient. Even chickens right out of the egg will recoil from a spider or a snake. And you may have seen those cat videos where you put a cucumber up behind a cat and they respond very strongly. That's probably because the cat thinks the cucumber, at least initially, is a snake. So these are very old survival mechanisms embedded in our brain structure. And there's another set which can be learned and become automatic. Sometimes it's with practice. The longer you practice something like piano or reading or anything else, you become better at it and it moves into the automatic mode. You don't have to think about it anymore. There's also those things that we learn from our culture, that we are exposed to from the moment we are born and onwards. And those things also get embedded into this automatic response system. And so we, therefore, will act on them without thinking about them, because thinking requires energy, and we tend to want to conserve energy. And that's where we will find some of our implicit biases. And an example of that is the immediate associations we have when we see a person or a CV. This guy walking on the south side of the street. People were crossing the street because they immediately made an association. Some, although it's not clear that all, of the police shootings that have been so much in the news this last year are probably the result of this kind of response. See a black person, see a threat. And so a 13-year-old gets shot. Now, implicit bias is that kind of reflexive association we have that results from our cultural milieu in which we most of the time, unless we work at it, are not aware of. And one of the perhaps good things to come out of all of this strife of the last year is an increasing awareness of this and our increasing willingness to try to grapple with it. I emphasize again that this is shared by all members of the culture. Black policemen have been on the other side of that gun as well as white policemen. So these biases can motivate our behavior, can guide our behavior, even though we don't know it, and people with good intentions will suffer from these biases as well unless they take means to try to think about it. Which is why I think it's important that hard scientists, those of us in the hard sciences, really have to deal with this. We will say to ourselves, well, we're not biased. We select for merit. But the fact of the matter is we don't. One study that was done not so very long ago was to ask faculty across the country, it was almost 400 faculty members, to evaluate 2 CVs and to ask what they would offer that person for a job as a technician in their lab. And one of the CVs was headed by a female name and the other was headed by a male name. And so the faculty were then asked, well, how much would you offer this person? Would you offer them a job? What kinds of mentoring would you offer, and so forth? Well, everybody, young faculty, older faculty, female faculty, male faculty, preferred the male candidate, even though the CVs were constructed to be equivalent in educational background, capability, references, and all of the things that we use to judge merit. And they would have offered that individual a few $1,000s more in salary. And they would offer more mentoring benefits. So we really need to know if we can do something about these kinds of responses that we have due to the culture in which we have grown up. Oh, and by the way, and if you think you don't have implicit biases, I suggest you go to the Implicit Bias website. It's on this slide, and you can find it by searching implicit bias. And there are some 15 tests or so, because there's all kinds of implicit biases, and take the test. You don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to share it. Just take the test. It's incredibly informative and very humbling. So, System 1 at work. System 1 is working when those of you in this audience whose English is your native language, you cannot misunderstand a simple sentence in English. You just can't. You can't not know that 1 and 1 is 2 in this audience. When I say Paris, you're going to think of France, and vice versa. If I say capital of France, that will come to your mind in this audience. It is, you can't stop it. The thought is there. We suffer, and we know that we suffer, from perceptual mistakes. This is one. These two tabletops, to me at least, and I'm sure to you, do not look like they are the same size. But if we outline one of them, and then rotate that shape and impose it on the second one, they are exactly the same size. This is not a failure. This is a success of a two-dimensional perceptual system, our visual system, that has to deal with a three-dimensional world. We have evolved the mechanism to make it possible for us to realize that it's a three-dimensional world out there. So when we see certain cues, we interpret them automatically as three-dimensional. And even knowing that it's a two-dimensional representation of the same size, we can't change the way that we see it. It's really a success in how we deal with a two-dimensional representation on our retina and brain and a three-dimensional reality out there. Well, just like we make perceptual, we see optical illusions, we make associative illusions as well. So we link things in an automatic way. So a germ will be linked to cold, lime to green. If you say orange, you're not going to think about a lime, you're going to think about an orange. Things to categories, apples or fruits. There's an idea is activated that has a very rich set of associations that we've been building ever since we were born, and that we aren't aware of most of them. And that results in something called priming. So that, for example, if we talk about foods and eating, and you know it's after lunch and we're all getting hungry and we'll go have lunch in a bit, then you will tend to complete this here as soup, not as soap. But if I talk about the shower in the morning and, you know, if it's a hot day, maybe you want one at night, then you'll be more inclined to complete it as soap. And actions can be primed by events we're not aware of. So one experiment that was used to develop this idea was one in which undergraduates were told to come into a room. You know, undergraduates are the prime experimental subjects for many psychological studies. So in this particular study, undergraduates were brought into a room and they were told that the study was about a word association test that they were going to take. So they sat in this room and they had this set of words and they were supposed to connect them with other words on the list and so forth. What the students didn't know is that that wasn't the test. That was a priming thing. After they had been at it for a while, the students were told that there were refreshments in the room down the hall. And if they wanted to, they could take a break and go down the hall and get a drink and a cookie. And so the words in one of those situations were words that were related to illness and age. You know, crippled, old, halting, all those kinds of words. Whereas in the other situation, it was words that were rather more innocuous and had to do with any other number of things, but not with age or inability at all. So then when the students got up to go find their reward for having done this task, what was the experiment was to measure the speed at which they walked for that cookie. The students who had been thinking about age and illness and disability walked significantly more slowly down the hall than did their compatriots who had just been doing random, unfraught words. And this, of course, like all good experiments, is simple, it's replicable, and it has very robust numbers. The statistics are quite good. System 2 requires attention. You must you can measure it. It turns out, they noticed this early on, Kahneman and his coworker Tversky, who died, by the way, before the Nobel Prize was given. Your pupils dilate. And you can measure how hard you're working by the amount of pupil dilation. You can try it yourself with one of your students or colleagues. Brains use more glucose when system 2 is working. When you are thinking hard, you are using energy. There is a reason you're tired after a class or after writing a grant or after being to the library. You have done real work. You have used up energy. And as you become more skilled at a task, it requires less energy. All voluntary effort, whether it be mental, physical, or emotional, draw from the same pool of energy. That's not infinite in our bodies at any given time. So it all draws from the same energy. So if you use up energy doing one thing, you have less energy to do something else. And that may explain in part why we have this default mode of thinking. It really is to conserve energy for other purposes. So if you're focusing on hearing one voice in a very crowded room, that requires system 2. If you are filling out a tax form, requires thinking, requires system 2. Now, focus on a really difficult task can blind people to other things going on around them. And here, the classic experiment is one where individuals in a room like this are shown a video. And they are told that their task is, it's a basketball game, 2 teams, one in red, one in white. And they are told to count the number of times that the ball is passed from one team to another. And so people are sitting there counting the times that the ball is passed, and in the middle of this video, someone in a gorilla suit walks out onto the middle of the basketball court and stands there and then walks off. And after the video is over, people are told did you see the gorilla? And most people don't see the gorilla. And they don't even believe a gorilla is there. They have to be shown the video again to realize that there was a gorilla. So all of this is just to say we have limited capacity. We have to deal with ways of dealing with all of this information, and this is what evolves. Now, stereotype threat is the risk of confirming a self-characteristic, a negative stereotype about one's group. And of course, you can see how this might play into academic achievement gaps. In this country, African Americans were thought for a very long time to be less able than white Americans. And so this is ingrained in our culture. So when a highly talented student comes into a classroom and is black, that student is worried about performance relative to others because the student wants to do well. The student is there because somebody thought they could do well. But they're worried about doing well. Maybe they won't do well and will fulfill this stereotype. The same is true of women in math. Women in this country are thought to be less able at mathematics than are men. And so women often walk into a math class worrying about whether or not they will fulfill this stereotype. Now, in other countries, this isn't so. In Poland, there is no prejudice, there is no assumption that women are less able than men at doing math, and women in that country score equally well on exams. Now, the experiments that Claude did to show this were really elegant. What he did was he took a group of Princeton undergraduate math majors who were matched for in their scores and all that jazz that one matches for in a classroom, and he took them in 2 groups, men and women, 2 groups of men and women, and he said to one group, you're going to take a math test now, see ya in an hour. And there he saw the expected the gap in the scores between the women and the men in this math test. In the next set of individuals, he took men and women, same kind of high achieving individuals, and said, okay, you're going to take a math test now, and you may have heard that women don't do as well on math tests as men do. But I have to tell you that this test has been designed so that we don't see that effect. See you in an hour. Under those conditions, the men and the women score equally well. There is no gap in their scores. So the worry has been alleviated, so you're not devoting mental energy to worrying about doing well. You can focus on the task at hand. And so we can get in our own way because of this fear of fulfilling the stereotype that others may have about us. This works in sports. He did another experiment with a golf game where he took student athletes, and in one case he told them, okay, we're going to play a golf game, and this game is going to measure your ability to think strategically about sports. Under those conditions, the white athletes score better than the black athletes. But if you say to a group, we're going to do a golf game, and this game will measure your inherent athletic ability, flips. The black athletes do better than the white athletes. So now that's a case where the stereotype threat is on the white athletes. They know that in this country, at least, we tend to think that black athletes are better than white athletes. And so they're worrying about not performing, that they will be judged. And you can think, I'm sure yourself, of various situations where this might apply. I certainly know that I wish I had known this earlier in my own career. There are imaging studies. This is just to show you that there are imaging studies that different areas of the brain light up. Now, as all of you know, the brain is very complicated. There's intermixing of different areas, but nevertheless, there are discrete things that do show up, which says that something's going on that's different. I marked this little spot here, noted with system 1, because in individuals in which that region of the brain has been damaged, those individuals lose all gender bias. That's also the area that lights up when we're making political decisions. Go figure. So, psychologists and social scientists have long recognized that humans make systematic errors in judgment. There's data from a lot of sciences that converge, many of them from neuroscientists here. The human brain has evolved mechanisms to deal with this massive flow of data that we get all the time. And just because these are there does not mean that we cannot change behavior. But it is notable that as scientists in the heart, I cannot tell you how many times colleagues of mine have said, well, we're doing the best that we can. We're not prejudiced. We seek merit. And if a meritorious individual comes before us, we will surely hire them. Doesn't quite work that way. And so until we recognize that this is an issue, we're going to continue to make too slow progress. Now I'm going to stop here after I do this, which is to say that you can, with relatively simple interventions, become aware of and change this behavior. There's implicit bias training, and in day before yesterday's New York Times, there was an article which summarized some studies that show that rationality and intelligence are not the same, and that rationality is not linked to IQ, and that you can change you can change the rationality with which one reacts to a situation, even though such training doesn't really work very well for intelligence. But rationality you can affect. And in fact, the most recent study, which was highlighted in this New York Times editorial, came from here. Carol Morwedge is a faculty member in the business school at BU, and she has shown in a nicely done paper that just came out recently that if you show people a computer game or a video, an effective video, you can change their behavior. And that behavior will last for at least 2 months. Is that long enough? Of course not. But one kind of intervention, a short computer game, which by the way is more effective than a video, can be repeated at intervals. At the University of Michigan, for example, the faculty there, all of them, and I would love to know how this was accomplished, have agreed that every time there is a search committee, all of the members of the committee undergo implicit bias training before they begin their search, so that they are aware and they sort of think twice, click in that system too, in their searches. And as a result of that kind of training, the hiring over 10 years at the University of Michigan has increased the number of women and minorities, which I will show you here. In a relatively short time, you see a difference in hiring of women and minorities in the departments at the University of Michigan. And this is a controlled double study that was published recently by Molly Carnes. So I'm going to stop there and take questions, but I want to end with this. This is the standard hierarchy of the value of the sciences, where mathematics is at the top and the social sciences are at the bottom, with biology just, we have made it above the bottom, but not quite. And it occurs to me that as we're doing this, one of the reasons that we can say this, that we have this hierarchy, is that as you start at the top and go down, In mathematics, you can define everything you wish to study. It can all come down to an equation or set of equations. There aren't any loose ends, really. It's complicated. There are new things you have to learn often to get the math right. But you can wrap your mind around the whole of the problem that you wish to solve. As you go down that staircase, you can't do that. It's hard enough in biology. We cannot account for all of the factors that are taking place in a cell, in the interaction of cells, in the interaction of those cells in an organism, and certainly when we get to the whole organism between individuals. So social sciences are really very difficult because right now it amounts often to educated guesses. But the science has become more rigorous. The experiments are replicable. The data is accumulating, and perhaps we've got it backwards. It's not math. It's not even rocket science. It's much harder. Thank you very much. There's time for a few questions, and there's some microphones that are going to go around because this is being broadcast and we want people on the other end of the camera to be able to hear the questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. And in this group, surely there will be questions or comments. Also welcome. Yes.
Thank you for that talk. Lots of things to think about. You mentioned, so the last slide talked about some interventions that you can do with a search committee or training or that kind of thing. What would that look like? Or have you seen something like that? Or how would you go about implementing that?
If you go to the University of Michigan website, and if you send me an email, I can send you the direct link. They have examples of training materials which range from a slide presentation, just reminding people. Once you get going, you just need to be reminded. There's the first step often is to take the implicit bias test to recognize that they're there and to recognize this is something we really have to deal with. The second thing is to read some of these studies which say, and you can do something about them. There are a number of online resources. There's one about graduate students and integration into graduate schools. I don't think there's anything online yet about faculty, but the Michigan group is extremely generous with their materials. There's a whole website of references and materials that you can use. The interventions are things like computer games, where you have to make decisions, and you can get feedback on the decisions that you make, and that is the thing that seems to be very effective. I must say we're still at the beginning. I saw a set of slides that are used at NSF for implicit bias training. They're really deadly, boring, dull, awful. And so avoiding those kinds of things is probably a good idea. Yes? I'll get you next. Okay.
So you had said that the computer games will change people's behavior, but it wears off in a few months.
Well, that was the length of time under which the effect was measured. So I don't know that it wears off in a few months.
Because that was my question as to what there was in the environment that was getting people to
Right.
regress.
We don't know how long such interventions last. It's not clear that whether it needs to be repeated at regular intervals like a vaccine, a shot, or whether it sticks once you've become aware of it. It seems to me from some of the people I've talked to that once people are aware of it and are aware that it's an issue, then they very often will self-impose oh, let me think about this again. What if this CV were from a man instead of a woman, as I see? What if this tenure letter was about my colleague Joe instead of my colleague Jill or Jawanda? That kind of thing can often be enough to make you open your eyes just a little bit wider.
Sure, thanks.
And there was one over here.
So I recently read an article, and I think it was the Washington Post, talking about how women in Obama's, in the White House, work together. I think they called it Shine Theory. So I feel like that's a really great strategy to band together, create a group, and so that so basically the gist of it was that at meetings a lot of the women were feeling like their ideas were often ignored, but when that same idea was repeated by a man, that would be accredited to him. And so they banded together, and whenever someone came up with a great idea, another one would say, hey, that's a wonderful idea, and to sort of band together. So that was the basis of shine theory. But there were, I feel like, a lot of other strategies that are coming out. Lean In website is another
Yes.
great place that has strategies for women in terms of like motherhood bias and recall bias. So I think those are some great.
Yeah, Lean
great
In, I
places
should have
to look.
mentioned that. That's a great resource, both of website and the book, which actually got, I think, some unfair knocks in the reviews. I didn't read it for a long time after it came out because of the reviews, many of which were quite negative. But the book itself is a very scholarly look and covers a wide, it's really well referenced, and so it's an interesting read. So it's a good thing to look at. And she has some strategies which have worked in the commercial setting, which is also of interest. Yes, there's one back there.
I appreciate this talk. I haven't quite got my head around it, but just some thoughts. It seems to me would be a very helpful foundation when we talk about anti-racism and educating people around racism, that this might be one foundation for those discussions. It sort of takes the shame out of that and normalizes, it seems like.
Well, that's one of the reasons I was attracted to it when it resonated with me, because it takes away the finger pointing. Now, we live in a very sheltered environment, and so taking the finger pointing away is an important thing for us to do in this setting. But there are a lot of other settings where there's still a lot of fingers to be pointed, and it's often difficult to know the difference. So, you know, that's hard, but a reality in our society today.
The other thing that struck me, it came up, is mindfulness and sort of slowing down and teaching ourselves how to sort of not react but watch ourselves and not be judgmental. It struck me as kind of helpful to getting from system 1 to system 2 type thinking.
Yes. Good comments. Any others? Well then, thank you so very much for coming. I appreciate your attention.